My name is Erik Mason. I'm the Curator of History here at the Longmont Museum. My talk is going to focus on Longmont specifically. There are certainly many other immigration stories of note throughout Boulder County. Those of you that have been here know, for example, there's a large Italian population down in Louisville, other areas that have other significant populations. But really I wanted to focus on Longmont and the stories of Longmont. So that's where we're going to be spending most of our time. But we're actually going to start well before the founding of Longmont. Obviously, Native Americans have been in this area for millennia. In fact, there's new discoveries that have recently come to light that indicate people may well have lived in the Americas for as much as 25,000 years. So we keep pushing the date further and further back at which people first came to this area. But when we start to have written history is in about the 1830s, and that is when we have fur traders and robe traders coming into this area, building forts similar to this one. This is actually Fort Laramie up in Wyoming, but there were also forts along the Platte River just east of us here where the fur traders would come out. And many of those traders were themselves immigrants. They were often French or French-Canadian coming down into this area, connecting with particularly the Cheyenne and the Arapaho tribes that were living here at that time. Now, their world was hugely transformed in 1859 when a small amount of gold, probably no more than a few ounces, was discovered in a tributary of Cherry Creek on the south edge of Denver. And that set in motion an enormous gold rush. About 100,000 people set out for Colorado. And there were only probably 3,000 or 4,000 people living in Colorado at that point. So to put it in sort of a modern perspective, it would be as if 3 million people decided suddenly they were coming to Longmont. So you can imagine the tremendous impact it had on this area. And of course, many of those gold miners were themselves immigrants who had come to the Americas and were now trying to find a way to make their fortune in Colorado. Now, one of the things that I used a great deal in developing this presentation is the U.S. Census. Many immigrants left very little in the way of written records. They may have just passed through this area, moved on to other places. But the census, which happens every 10 years, is really one of the documents that is going to encompass all of the people, not just the ones who are the best known, not just the ones who were literate at that time, but really anyone who was living in Longmont was captured by the census. And you can see in this census here, we have one person, this particular sheet of census, Johanna Trautmann, was born in Germany and has now moved into Longmont. So by going through pages and pages of these census records, I've been able to compile the information that I'll be presenting today. Now, after the gold rush, pretty quickly people discovered that, well, the rumors of gold just kind of lying around on the ground weren't quite accurate. And so the population of Colorado actually declined in the later 1860s until another really significant event happened in 1870. This is the 1870 census. It's the first census that records people living in our immediate area. Now, Longmont had not yet been founded, but there was a community called Burlington, which was located more or less where the modern Highway 287, which is on an ancient north-south trail that's been documented in use since the 1840s and probably was in use for thousands of years by native peoples before that, where the 287 crosses the St. Vrain River. So if you're familiar with Longmont, the Burlington Village Shopping Center is kind of where the downtown Burlington, to the extent that there was one, existed. Now, Burlington was a much more spread out settlement. It actually spread out all along the banks of the St. Vrain River, up really to the foothills and out to where the St. Vrain joins with the Platte. But you can see in this particular graph that already we've got some immigrant groups coming into this area. Surprisingly enough, a number of Canadians. This is actually a group that was a surprise to me. We don't know a lot about the Canadian population coming into Longmont. And as we go forward, we'll see that actually they don't seem to have been an ongoing presence. Eventually the Canadians are supplanted by other groups that have larger presences. We've also got certainly a large population coming from, at that time, Germany didn't actually exist as a state. It was a series of smaller principalities and smaller groups. So this was compiled out of lists in the census of things like Saxony and Prussia and Hesse and all these smaller groups that would then shortly afterwards merge to form the modern German nation state. We've also got Great Britain, which is always one of the largest contributors of people from other countries into the United States and into this area, and small groups coming from Ireland as well as other European countries. You can see there's it's about 7-8% of the population of Burlington was immigrants in 1870. Yes. These are actually individuals, yeah. So there were 21 people from Canada in a population of about 800 in the total Burlington area. So as I mentioned, in 1870 we had a really significant event in this area, and that was the arrival of the railroad in Denver. The Transcontinental Railroad actually came across from Kansas, and then a branch of the Union Pacific, it was called the Central Pacific, came down from Cheyenne and connected up in Denver. This illustration is a wonderful illustration of one of the things that the arrival of the railroad really generated, which was this idea of a colony movement. This particular one, at the bottom it says, "Departure of a colony of immigrants for Colorado." Unfortunately, it's not actually departure for Longmont. Although Longmont was founded as a colony, this particular one was called the German colonization colony. They tried a colony down in the San Luis Valley. And the idea behind all of these colonies was that people would pool their resources. They would go out to this area, they would buy a lot of land, they would create the infrastructure, they would share things in common. And most of the colonies did not do so well. The German colonization colony failed within probably 9 months, but two stand out. The Union colony was founded by a man named Horace Greeley, and they would adopt his name as the name of their town. And then a year later, in 1871, the folks of Chicago said, well, you know, if Horace Greeley in New York could do this, then we can do it too. And so they said, we're going to found the Chicago, Colorado colony. And that would become the town we're in today, Longmont. So here is a plat, one of the first maps of the Chicago, Colorado colony, and one of the first photographs of downtown Longmont as it existed in 1872. Now, because it was a colony, we have the list of everyone that joined. And it was not a cheap endeavor. It actually cost $155, which was quite a lot of money in that time to join the colony. But because we have this full list of all the colonists, we know where everyone was coming from who immigrated into Longmont or joined the colony here. And it's not surprising, being as it's called the Chicago, Colorado colony, that the largest groups are from Illinois and from Colorado. It's also probably not that big a surprise that just 6 years after the end of the Civil War, only 2% of the population came from the southern or border states. The South was still so devastated, it was difficult for anyone to come up with the kind of funds it would need to join a colony. The only actual folks who were come on up front if you wish, who were from another country, were 3 lonely Canadians. Everyone else who joined the colony was already living in the U.S. at the time that the colony was founded. But what really struck me as I was compiling this information is this group here. 10% of the colonists were from Massachusetts. And I was thinking, well, what in the world's going on in Massachusetts? There didn't seem to be a logical connection. There's no colony movement that I'm aware of springing out of Massachusetts. I could understand New York. It's a bigger city. It had the Union colony. But when I did some more research, I found an interesting story. So a man named Robert Collier was a Unitarian minister who was in Chicago. He was actually elected the first president of the sort of nascent colony organization in Chicago when they began to form in November of 1870. And he took a trip back to Massachusetts where he gave a speech that was apparently so inspiring that some 30 people decided from Massachusetts they were going to join this colony, even though they knew virtually nothing about it beyond what Reverend Collier had presented. Reverend Collier would not end up coming to Longmont. He stayed in Chicago, became very prominent in Chicago circles for many years after that. But Collier Street in Longmont was named in honor of his efforts at promoting the colony. So what was it that these early colonists were doing? Well, by and large, they were farmers, and particularly in those early years, they were wheat farmers. You can see here this illustration of fall wheat near Longmont, Colorado. Now, one of the things that's important to think about, they were growing fall wheat at that time. They didn't actually yet have winter wheat because it was one of the immigrant groups that we'll encounter a little bit later that would introduce that crop into this area. Now we're going to jump back to the census and take a look at 2 different decades of groups, immigrant groups living in Longmont. So in 1880, Longmont was a very small community, and there were only probably about 780 people living in Longmont by 1880. And the census records a pretty small immigrant population. A couple of Swedes, still folks from Great Britain and Germany, and 1 each from Ireland, Austria, and Switzerland. Now, the 1890 census, sadly, was destroyed. There was a fire in Washington, D.C., where those census records were kept. Many of the records were burned, and sadly enough, many of the others were eventually just tossed out. They said, oh, heck, who needs these records? They've been damaged. We don't want to keep them. Most diehard genealogists say, you know, if I got a time machine, before I even went back and visited my great-grandfather, I'd go back and save the 1890 census because, you know, it's a huge loss in our heritage, and genealogists are still working to use other records to piece it back together. But we have to jump forward to 1900 to get another snapshot of the immigrant population at that time. And we now see, again, this large contingent of Canadians, but quite a sizable group of Swedes, Danes, and Norwegians. And this is the first group that I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail, the Scandinavian populations. And we talk about them as well in our exhibition here in the Kaiser Permanente Center. The first major immigrant group to come into this region were really the Swedes. They came in starting even in the 1860s, before Longmont itself was founded. And they clustered largely in a region west of Longmont, a community that they would call Risby, after a community that some of them had come from back in Sweden. And once they were a little more settled, they decided, well, we want to build something permanent here. We want to build a church, because they all primarily were from the same Lutheran faith. And so they built this church, which they called the Risby Church, on North 63rd Street. It still stands there today. And it's patterned after country churches in Sweden. It harkens back to their own homeland and really reflects both their longing for their homeland as well as their celebration of being in a new country and being able to build such a fine facility. Another important Scandinavian group that came out in large numbers were the Norwegians. Here we see the Anderson family, their home about 2 miles south of Longmont on Highway 287. And they're actually all decorated ready for a big Norwegian Lutheran event at their home. We've got another photograph of the whole church congregation gathered in front of the home here. But one of the things that I love about this one is they're actually dressed in what appears to be kind of a native Norwegian costume. That was really not typical. I think they probably did that maybe for this photograph, kind of to show that they were still acknowledging their heritage, and indeed they're flying a large Norwegian flag, but also a large American flag. So very much saying, well, we're part of both cultures, and we celebrate both here in Colorado. Now in 1903, an event occurred that would again transform Longmont in this region. The Longmont Sugar Factory was built east of Longmont. It still stands today. It hasn't been in operation for many years, but the building is still a major landmark. And it became a major employer both in Longmont and also was an outlet for a huge new cash crop that was grown by the farmers. Now, when they were working to get the factory established, the businessmen of Longmont really wanted it because they saw the opportunities to have, higher paying jobs and a steady labor force for the factory. But the farmers weren't so sure. They said, well, nobody's ever grown sugar beets much in this area. Are they going to work out? So it was quite a sell job because the farmers had to commit to grow enough beets for that first season that the factory could actually operate. So the farmers did that, and one of the things that they discovered is beets are a very labor-intensive crop. And one of the reasons for that is, here is a picture of what a sugar beet should look like. This is what the factory wanted. It's a nice, big, fat sugar beet. But when you plant a beet, you don't get just one nice, fat beet like this. Back then, the way the seeds worked, you actually got a whole clump of little beets. And so if you didn't very carefully go through and by hand thin out all but the strongest, you got something that looked more like this. And this was really not what the sugar company wanted. Well, to do that required going on hands and knees down each row, and it meant that there was a need for a great deal more farm labor. And we see that reflected in the growth of the immigrant population between 1900 and 1910. So in 1900, the green bars here are the immigrant population. And we can already see this Canadian group is starting to tail off. We're getting less folks from Canada, but more folks coming from Germany, again, Great Britain, still an increase in the population from Sweden, and also an interesting new group, these Russian Germans. I'll talk more about them in a bit. But when I was looking at the 1910 census, I thought, it seems like there should have been even more folks because I know they needed such a huge amount of labor. And I realized, well, one of the things I was doing was just looking within the city of Longmont. And the city itself, the immigrant population in 1910 was about 7%. So I started to look at surrounding regions. And I started with the town of North Longmont. Now, for those of you that have heard of North Longmont, you may have heard that it was kind of a notorious little community because its main purpose was to provide alcohol to the dry citizens of Longmont. Longmont was a temperance town, didn't allow the sale of alcohol. But North Longmont, which was located literally across the street, across 9th Avenue, could have alcohol. It was a separately incorporated town at that time. Only about 260 people lived there, but in doing this census, I think there's something interesting about North Longmont. It was really a very diverse community. In fact, of the 4,000 or so people that lived in Longmont proper, there were 15 different nationalities represented. But in the fraction of that, only about 250 people living in North Longmont, there were 8 nationalities represented, including the first person we have recorded as coming from Japan, living in North Longmont in 1910. And you can see 12% of the population of North Longmont were immigrants. So it was an opportunity, and I think it's something we'll see often, is that these communities that are perhaps a little more marginal, perhaps not considered as, up and coming as other places, provide an opportunity for immigrants to come in and settle in these areas. So then I started looking at the farm areas right around Longmont. This is a slide of North Longmont, the North Longmont Town Hall, which, interesting enough, still stands on Main Street, just north of 9th Avenue. So northeast Longmont also was quite a bit more diverse. More immigrants were living in the area northeast of Longmont on the farms, again reflecting that need for farm labor. Northwest Longmont, not quite so much. Southwest Longmont, again, some immigrant population. But when we got to southeast Longmont, all of a sudden, that's where the immigrants are. And indeed, nearly all of this population are Russian Germans. Now, the Russian German, it's an interesting thing. What in the world's a Russian German? They just couldn't decide who they were? So I wanted to go a little bit more into their story, because I think it's an interesting one. The Russian Germans were ethnically German, but they had been living in Russia since the 1700s. They had been invited there by Catherine the Great of Russia. She was actually also of German extraction. She wanted Germans to come into particularly the Volga River Valley, kind of as a buffer between the heartland of Russia and some of the more unruly parts of her empire. In order to entice these German farmers to come in, she promised them freedom of religion. She promised them exemption from military service, protection and respect for the German culture, and if things didn't work out, they would have the opportunity to leave. Well, over the next century or so, Russian nationalism built and built, and there was greater and greater resentment of this group of privileged foreigners living in their midst. And as a result, by 1871, all of those privileges, except the opportunity to leave, had been taken away. And as a result, the Russian Germans felt it's probably time to move on, and so many of them moved to America, where they looked for places that had a similar climate to what they were used to in that area of Russia. And they settled a lot along the upper Midwest and eventually down into Colorado. And one of the crops that they would bring with them was a new kind of wheat called turkey red wheat. And it could be planted in winter and then grow up and became the winter wheat that now is one of the staple crops of this area. Here is a German-Russian family, the Wagner family, as they appeared still in Russia. I love the hats that the Mins are wearing. They're such a wonderful, classic sort of Russian look to them, although they were ethnically German. Then coming to this country, we have another Russian-German family. This is the Bakel family. One of the things that Russian Germans tend to be known for is they're very prolific. And here we have the Schlegel family. It was an average of 8 children per Russian-German family. And as a result, there's quite a few Schlegels still around Longmont even today. Now, between 1910 and 1920, we see now 1910 are the green bars, 1920 are the red bars. There's a lot of similarities in the population, but we see one group has had a tremendous jump. Folks from Mexico, there were only a handful within the city of Longmont itself. There were probably more working out on the farms around it. But by 1920, all of a sudden, they're the third leading group. And the reason for that is because there was a tremendous upheaval in Mexico between 1910 and 1920. The Mexican Revolution started in 1910 and really spanned that entire decade. Different groups, different warlords battling back and forth. It made for a very difficult time in Mexico, and a lot of people began to leave and move into the more stable United States, where they felt there were a lot more opportunities. They became, many of them, sugar beet workers. This unnamed man here is doing what's called topping beets. So you can just barely see in his right hand he has a knife. It's about an 18-inch long knife. And in order to send the beets to the factory, you had to remove the top where all the greens were, because those were not anything that the factory could use, and so you had to slice that off. Well, it had to be a job with a lot of skill, because it wouldn't take much to slice right down into your leg. And in fact, a lot of beet workers did have scars on their legs from having that happen once or twice when they weren't paying attention. But the sugar beet workers were certainly a key part of Longmont's economy, and indeed the Great Western Sugar Factory, who actually produced a video, or a film in those days, which we have parts of in our Front Range Rising History exhibit, that was promoting really coming up to the United States and how pleasant it was to come up and live here, avoid the chaos in Mexico, and it's also a little bit perhaps painting a little bit of a rosy picture of what it would have been like to live here. But it's a wonderful film. I encourage you all to check it out in the Front Range Rising exhibit. Now, prior to the 1880s, there was really no such thing as illegal immigration into the United States. Immigration was essentially unrestricted. Anyone who wished to come in, if they had a ticket, if they could walk across the border, they were in the U.S. and they were here legally. But starting in the 1880s, a series of ever more restrictive laws were passed, reducing the immigrant flow. So in 1882, the first of these laws was passed prohibiting Chinese laborers from coming in. This was a result of a lot of fear over what they called the yellow peril. The Chinese that were coming over to work on the railroads and other things. In Longmont, we had a few people from China in the early years who stereotypically, they were actually working in laundries. That was one of the areas that they could have their skills were appreciated enough they could do that without people complaining that they were taking jobs of other people. In 1907, the laws were restricted further. They prohibited people with contagious diseases, people with physical and mental defects, and that was kind of construed broadly to mean a lot of different things. And also polygamists and anarchists. I always wonder how they knew if you were an anarchist if you were coming in. I guess they ask, are you an anarchist? And if you were dumb enough to say yes, then, well, they're going to send you back. In 1917, laws were passed that restricted immigration from all of Asia. There had been actually some earlier agreements, particularly with the government of Japan, restricting immigration there, but then pretty much all of Asia was considered unwelcome after 1917. In 1921, the Emergency Quota Act restricted immigration really to just Northern Europeans. And in 1924, they established permanent national quotas and capped total immigration at only 150,000 people a year. So one of the things that this did, of course, was create suddenly the need for people to come in above that to, for example, work in the farm fields. And this is where we begin to see the first instances of illegal immigration, people coming in who were above that quota or were from an area of the world that could not, were not allowed. You know, One of the other things to realize is the 1920s was an era when there was a lot of very reactionary policies going on. It was the height of the Ku Klux Klan, and so it was a lot about fear and about these, Catholics were coming in, these foreigners were coming in. I don't think there was a sense of, here's a practical solution. It was simply, these are the other, we need to make sure they stay out. And I think here, locally, there were farmers that were saying, yeah, how am I going to get my crops picked? And indeed, this would be a challenge, as we'll see in the coming era. In 1930, really, we see this is some of the largest immigrant populations that we'll have in this area for quite some time as a result of some of these restricted policies. I love this one because it's actually what the official term is, place of birth. And so for people who were actually born on a ship coming to the U.S., they recorded they were born at sea. So I included that because I just loved that they actually, there would be people who would be really not born in any country. They were born at sea. But you can see the decline of the immigrant population. In 1920, 7%, steady decline until 1970, with less than 2% of the population would be immigrants at that point. Again, based on those national laws, the legislation that was passed. Now, one of the groups that we didn't see as much within the city of Longmont, but we know they were here, we know they were farming in this area, are the Japanese immigrants. This man, Goroku Kanemoto, is the patriarch of the Kanemoto family. And he actually was, in some ways, an illegal immigrant. He came to Mexico because the U.S. was not accepting Japanese immigrants at that time. And in order to get into the U.S., what he had to do was buy a train ticket from Mexico to Canada. And then in Denver, he hopped off the train, but he couldn't take any of his luggage or anything because that would arouse suspicion that he was trying to sneak into the country. So he arrived in Denver essentially with nothing. Spent a few years in Brighton and then came to Longmont. He was able, and I'm not quite sure how, to get a wife sent over from Japan. It was an arranged marriage. He knew her only from a picture. But they started a family. And the other thing is that the Japanese, native Japanese could not own land in Colorado. So only as his children got to be old enough, they were birthright citizens, could they begin to buy land. And soon the Kanemotos began to farm areas south of Longmont. World War II would have another pretty significant impact on the Japanese American community in this area. On the left here we have the girls in the Maeda family. The Maedas lived here in the Longmont area. They were farmers. They're dressed to attend a ceremony at the Buddhist temple. And we have other photographs of them in full Western costumes. So they moved back and forth between cultures pretty fluidly. But in 1942, they got a notice from some cousins of theirs out in California, the Nishidas. And the Nishidas said, we've been given a few weeks to pack our goods and sell everything, any of our property, because we're now considered enemy aliens. Even though we're loyal citizens, we have lived here for years, but as a result of the attack on Pearl Harbor, all of the Japanese on the West Coast will either be sent to internment camps, or if we can prove that we have family somewhere else, somewhere in the interior of the country, we can go there. And so, of course, the Maedas said, well, of course, come and stay with us. We welcome you. And indeed, as many people as could, but it was challenging because they had just a few weeks. So many of them ended up in the internment camps. But one of the other things that might have made the Nishidas feel a little bit more welcome was the courageous stance of the governor of Colorado. Ralph Carr was governor at that time, and he was alone in the Western governors of saying, this is wrong. We should not imprison people purely on the basis of their nationality. They've committed no crime. There's no rule of law that they have broken. They're simply being imprisoned because they are Japanese. Today he is celebrated. At that time, actually, the voters of Colorado voted him out of office in the next election. In World War II, then, there was a tremendous need for farm labor. Most of the young men of fighting age were off either in Europe or in the Far East, and so there was a tremendous need for more labor. And they filled that in a lot of ways, but one of the biggest was creating what the federal government called the Bracero Program. This was a program that provided opportunities for people from Mexico to come up, work in the fields, and then return back to Mexico. Those strict quotas were still in place for any kind of long-term stay, but they realized it was not possible to have this have the farm labor without these groups, and so they did open up to this program in the 40s and then on into the 50s. But the Bracero program would actually cease. There was a lot of political pressure, a lot of concern about it, and unfortunately what that meant is essentially those workers now had to go underground. They had to become illegal immigrants because there was simply no legal way for them to come through, and the farmers still needed those crops picked. This is a photograph taken of a migrant worker at the Tanaka farm in the early 1990s. Migrant labor certainly has still played a major part for many, many decades. But immigration law began to loosen up, starting in 1965, when really for the first time since 1924, they began to raise the quotas. They began to allow people to come in from Asia and from Africa. And then in 1990, there was actually quite a dramatic increase in the cap from 170,000 to 700,000. So immigrants began to come in larger numbers from all over the world. And we see that in Longmont as well. Now, Longmont experienced dramatic population growth from the 50s up through the 1990s. This is the overall population of Longmont. You can see the population of immigrants remained almost flat through those decades. But starting in 1990, then we start to get fairly significant growth in the immigrant population. And actually in 2013, the most recent year for which we have data, the immigrant population in Longmont is larger than it's ever been in the history of Longmont. It's about 13% now. And those are people coming from all over the world. People coming, obviously a large percentage from Mexico, but also from India, from Europe still, from China. So people now come to Longmont from all over the world to take advantage of many of the economic opportunities we have here. Longmont does celebrate its immigrant heritage in many ways. The Tower of Compassion stands in Kanemoto Park, just a few blocks west of us here. It was donated by the Kanemoto family, both honoring their Japanese heritage and then also as a thank you to the community of Longmont for what they felt was a very welcoming spirit that they've experienced here. The Latino culture and Mexican culture is celebrated in works like the Unity Project in Kensington Park, as well as many other events within our community. And every midsummer, the Risby Church is filled with a traditional Swedish midsummer service. Although regular services are no longer held there, they do continue to hold special services at midsummer and at Christmas. Thank you so much.